Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a special book talk sponsored by the Alabama Department of Archives and History. My name is Scotty Kirkland, and I serve as the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator here at the Archives. Before we begin today's program, I just have one brief announcement to share with you. Our long-running lecture series, Food for Thought, continues on Thursday, April 15th at noon with historian Dr. Burtis English of Alabama State University. Dr. English is going to be discussing African Americans in higher education in Alabama after the Civil War. The program will begin at noon on April 15th, and you can watch that program right here virtually. March is Women's History Month and American Quilt Month, and sitting at the nexus of these two events is the topic of today's book talk. Alabama Quilts, Wilderness Through World War II, brings together as no other source before the textile treasures of our state's cultural landscape. The result of an enormous documentary effort, this publication features quilts made from before Alabama became a state through the mid-20th century. It explores the cultural context of these quilts, commemorates the times in which they were created, the lives of their makers, and the events for which they were made. 2 decades in the making, Alabama Quilts was published last year by the University Press of Mississippi with the support of the Alabama State Council on the Arts and the Friends of the Alabama Archives. The Archives Director, Steve Murray, penned the book's foreword. You can purchase your very own copy of Alabama Quilts through the Museum of Alabama's online store, Alabama Originals. The book is offered today and tomorrow with a 10% discount, and in a few moments we'll put the link to purchase the book here in the comments. Our guest today is Carole Ann King, who co-authored Alabama Quilts alongside the late Mary Elizabeth Johnson Huff. She is curator for Landmarks Foundation of Montgomery at Old Alabama Town and is the author and co-author of several books on state and local history. She holds degrees in art and museum studies from Auburn University and Western Kentucky University. Ms. King, welcome.
Thanks, Scotty. It's great to be here today. And of course, I always like to talk about our favorite thing, Alabama quilts. But I do want to talk a little bit first, as we go through this, about Mary Elizabeth Johnson Huff, best known to those of us who knew her and loved her as Sunshine, both professionally and personally. So from now on through the rest of the presentation, I will be calling her Sunshine, so we'll all know who we're actually talking about. Sunshine was actually the author of this book, and I call myself the assistant to the author of this book. I wanted to do a little memorial to Sunshine, actually. She actually grew up in Franklin and Monroe County. She attended the University of Alabama, and then she went to New York as a craft book editor. She always loved fabric and quilts. She came home to Alabama and worked at Progressive Farmer in the Southern Living in the Birmingham area, and then went on back home to Monroe County, where she ran a bed and breakfast for a long time until she came to Montgomery with her husband, John Huff, and they were operating a printing business. This is just a few of the images that I came up with that were my favorites as we went on this 2-decade road trip around the state of Alabama, documenting Alabama quilts. She and the former Miss Bentley, First Lady of Alabama, were very close friends because they shared that passion of quilts. And Sunshine loved to talk to anybody who would talk her language, quilts and fabrics. The image that you see in the lower left-hand corner was one we actually took a long time ago, and I wanted to just leave it in there to remember us. That's what we looked like when we started this 20 years ago. We took that particular image to use as the back jacket cover of our book. But 20 years later, we had another plan at that particular point in time. But how we actually met was in the 1980s, the Birmingham Museum of Art went upon a journey through an NEA grant, National Endowment for the Arts, and they did the Alabama Decorative Arts Survey, surveying decorative arts all over the state. Gail Andrews, who was the curator at that particular time, was very interested in quilts, and so a lot of emphasis was done on that. Here at Landmarks, we hosted the Black Belt field worker, Andrew Glasgow. We took his phone messages, took his mail while he was out surveying, photographing, and documenting Alabama-made decorative arts. Sunshine was hosting field workers at her bed and breakfast in Monroe County and mentoring them on quilts and what to look for. So At the end of that, in the 1990s, there was actually a Made in Alabama exhibit that traveled throughout the region that focused on all of the information that had been documented in that survey, which is now available at the Birmingham Public Library. She looked through it, and she was working on the Mississippi quilt book that was actually funded by the Mississippi Quilt Guild. And Alabama didn't have a quilt guild. We didn't have a statewide quilt guild, nor did we have a state quilt book. And so she looked around, and I was honored to be selected to take upon this task with her, which then lasted another 2 decades. So who were going to be our partners with this? We then looked at all of these different types of art organizations and museums around the state who might could help us on this. One of the things that had happened in the decorative art survey is that the field workers did not have an urgency for quilts that were in public health permanent collections, such as museums. They really focused on the quilts that were held by individuals. They were showing up in estates or things that were endangered to lose their story. So a lot of emphasis was put on that. And we actually did a lot of work within organizational collections as well, documenting them. It's the first White House, the first White House, landmarks here, and the archives and history as well. We went back and did a lot of documentation on that as well. But these were the partners that stepped to the plate and helped us from 2003 to 2010, when the last quilt share that we did happened up in Tuscumbia and Belmont. However, there are a lot of other smaller happenings that happened even after that. But our very first quilt share, Burr on the Mountain in Huntsville, was a real learning experience. In 6 hours, or whether it turned out to be 9 hours, we documented 240 quilts. People actually came. They were rolling suitcases full of quilts in. And so we backed up a little bit and made some parameters on exactly what it was we were going to document. The first question was, what is an Alabama quilt? An Alabama quilt, we decided, was something that was made in Alabama and most of its life in Alabama, but not limited to that, because we found a lot of other quilts that had been made in other places, came to Alabama very early on, and had a very strong Alabama provenance as well. We also decided that we would only document quilts that had a strong provenance as well. We saw a lot of beautiful quilts that had been bought in antique stores and flea markets that, they had no relationship documented to Alabama. So we had to start kind of going through that from the very beginning. We actually came up with a process to send out prior to a visit or prior to a quilt share day to all of the different partners who were coming to the plate to help us. And a lot of people actually used this organizational tips without even having a share day with us, but some of the local quilt share people who wanted to have an event within their thing, we created so you want to do it. So the suggestions for organizing. One of the first things that we did was create a step for checking in the different places. We turned all of this over to our host. We gave them a list of supplies to have, and then they helped us out with volunteers and all the labor that actually took place on those particular days. As you checked your quilt in, you were given a documentation form that gave you a number, and we attached that number to the quilt. The thing we really needed to do very early on, we discovered, was to separate the owner from the quilt, because we wanted to do an objective physical analysis of the quilt. And we also wanted the owner of the quilt to go into an interview process with some of the volunteers where we recorded the oral history of what the owner had to say about who actually made this quilt, the community it came from, the reason it was made. It was actually a four-page oral history interview. Also, an interchangeable step was our photography, where, as you can see a little bit of it here, interview and photography were two different steps, and were interchangeable, where we took photographs of the quilts. We did detail work as well. And I wanted to right here to say a little bit about Dave Martin. After our process was finished in 2010, 2013, when we decided it's now time to put the book together, we had to go back, pull the quilts, the ones that were going in the book, and we had to have them professionally done, photographed for publication. And at this point, we're into digital as well. And we looked around to a friend of ours who was actually an Associated Press photographer. He was a sports photographer. And he said, what are y'all talking about? And we're like, but Dave Martin rose to the occasion, and he probably, we did 6 quilt days where the quilts that had been selected for the book were brought back to Montgomery, and Dave photographed them for the actual book as well. And he shot at least 200 quilts. And I believe that's about the same number of images that are actually in the quilt book. Dave, however, did pass away unexpectedly, doing exactly what he loved to do, which was film a football game. He was at a playoff game in Atlanta, New Year's Eve, 2013. His work with us was done, and we miss him greatly. There was also a step within our quilt share days for an analysis. This is when the quilt was put physically on a table, and a lot of the local volunteers loved to analyze it. The volunteers came with their stitch knowledge and would help fill out the documentation forms. This also helped a lot with the fabric dating and the quilt pattern knowledge as well. And it also was a buy-in for the local quilt groups. At the checkout, we took the opportunity to refold the quilts and give them back before they went back to their owner, to refold them in a different way, sort of a little educational tip on folding and refolding your tips, your quilts for storage. And we've emphasized to the owner the need to occasionally, recycling the folding creases and to keep it out of the light, and other types of conservation things that we had picked up as we looked at those particular quilts. To help fund the whole process of this, these quilt share days, we asked for a small fee, $7.50, for a copy of the complete 6-page documentation form. So we would supply the owner afterwards with a copy of the oral history that they had given us of the quilt, as well as photographs, so that they could keep the two together for posterity and to pass the quilts on to their families as well, and as well as some conservation tips as to how to keep their quilts safely as well. We had sent them up supplies needed, and they provided all of these things for us as we arrived at our quilt share days, as well as much gracious hospitality in breakfast, snacks, lovely lunches. They were very much community events, and we got a lot of marketing throughout the state as well on these events. After we had collected all this information, we're like, what do we do with this now? How do we organize this quilt book? So we looked at, how do we do it? Do we do it the type of quilts we came across? Stars, whole cloths, crazy quilts. Do we do it chronologically, or maybe even geographically? But considering quilts were made and they reflect the creativity and they reflect the opinions of their makers, and what's happening around them at that particular time in their community and statewide, we decided that chronological was about the best way for us to do it. So this is how we broke our chapters down into the different parts of Alabama history, the different movements and the different things that were happening in Alabama at the time. So these are actually our chapter heads and how we broke the quilts down. I will say Sunshine wrote the book. Sunshine put this book together She had the photographs ready to go, the captions, right before her death. She didn't was very concerned with chapter 7, our very last one, which was Alabama in the mid 20th century, which was so packed full of research and photographs and all types of sidebar information that we had collected. And Sarah Bliss Wright from Mobile stepped to the plate. Sarah Bliss put chapter 7 together, Alabama in the mid 20th century, and did a lovely job blending it in with the rest of the book, and was totally approved by Sunshine. So Sunshine was able to see that her book was totally complete. The first quilt that we saw, we had put 1950 as our cutoff date, because by 1950 you get commercialization. This is after World War II. The role of women is totally different in the home, and plus that's just this massive surge of quilts in the 1950s that were just totally overwhelming and really out of our scope. So that was our end date. We really hadn't thought about a beginning date until we came across this particular quilt. There were rumors of this one. It actually lived in a permanent collection in the state of Alabama at Magnolia Grove in Greensboro. Magnolia Grove is managed by the Alabama Historical Commission. It's a whole cloth quilt fragment, and all the family documentation points to 1682. Eleanor Cunningham. Eleanor Cunningham was the director at Magnolia Grove, and she had done a lot of research herself and compiled this, and was really able to document it through letters and notes attached to the quilt. It's just a fragment of a quilt. It's silk, and it's actually quilted to what looks like a wool blanket. It's very well taken care of in a frame at Magnolia Grove. Magnolia Grove was built about 1840 by the Croom family, and it was passed down through the Hobson family in the 1870s. In this particular, the maker of the quilt was Sarah Knight outside Boston. And Sarah Knight actually left a note on the quilt that said, "It was made by me 45 years ago." And she dated that note 1727. So by the 1840s, when the Croom family comes into Greentown, up to Greensboro, and over in West Alabama, a Sarah was bringing this too. The quilt itself passed from the Sarahs in the different generations, and of course, as the generations went along, there were lots of Sarahs. So what happened was they just cut the quilt up, and all the different Sarahs had a piece of it, and it ended up one Sarah coming down as a pioneer into the state of Alabama. This is a central medallion quilt. I'm just going to sort of hit a few of the highlights in the book to sort of whet your appetite, so you can't wait to read it. Central medallion that was actually made in West Alabama too, probably Wilcox County. We're not sure exactly, about 1825. We can date it from the actually the materials, the chintzes that you see in it as well. There's a chintz roping around it that could be commercially purchased at that particular time. And I believe this is in the collection of the Archives and History. Another central medallion automobile in 1825. What we really found which was interesting, was that this particular, the center flower basket is actually a print. It was produced by John Houston around 1800. And Houston was probably one of the first printed fabric makers in this country. He appears in Philadelphia about 1774. So you would buy this, insert it in the middle, and then do all the quilting and the fancy work around it as well. So this one actually turned up, and we found quilts in very odd places as well. This was in Mobile Museum of Art. The whitework quilt in Tuscumbia was made by Mrs. Adair in Colbert County. You'll see we tried to go back and to look in all different areas of the state that hadn't been researched. before. This was about 1827, and this is the type of quilt that you would see in North Carolina 50 years earlier. So that makes sense. They were, as the pioneers came into Alabama, that they would be bringing these types of quilts or the knowledge about how to do it. It's almost like a sampler where there's lots of stuff work and raised work stitches on it as well. This is another one of those quilts. It wasn't made in Alabama, but it has a very early, strong story as they came into Elmore County. This was made in Charleston for the wedding of Elizabeth Mackenzie in 1826. This quilt lives in Montgomery now. It's been conserved and has actually traveled in several museums shows as well. It's a beautiful chintz quilt. Another type of quilt this is one of my favorites. This is a chintz quilt, but it's printed a dark. It's called a pillar. It was dated 1831. It actually came from Calhoun County, and Abigail Evans signed it herself, 1831. So this follows in the documentation of the quilt itself, which is another note that we talk to people about, to when you do make a quilt or you do make a piece of art, put your name on it, because you never know what's going to happen in the next decades, and in this case, in the next centuries. This is a Tree of Life from Otagoville, which is just outside Prattville. Very popular pattern in the 1830s and 1840s, because you could actually buy the Tree of Life, the center medallion right there, and then you could do all your kinds of fancy work around it. It was made by Elizabeth Nicholson in Macon County, and she married Mr. Nicholson. She married Joseph Wilkinson and then moved on to Otago County. He was a planter there. She had 9 children. Here's a little detail of it, and then a picture of Elizabeth herself. The variable star was a very popular one also. But you had to have a fair amount of resources, because this particular one, to produce a quilt like this particular one had a lot of chintz on it that you can see. But the unusual thing about this is that they're 96 squares. So the grandmother of Mattie Crabtree in Chambers County in Lafayette in 1840, she had a lot of time on her hands to make all of these stars. And this was for the hostess, actually, of Mattie Simpson Crabtree. This detail here shows you also that they purchased the side sashing fabric here. It's an unusual that we noted because this is the same pattern. It's just in different colors. So this was, they had to have ordered it and had to have had the resources as well as the time to create such a beautiful quilt. This is the Feathered Star from Demopolis, about 1840. Mary Glover actually put this one together. Speaking of finding in odd places, this particular quilt was found in the attic of Lyon Hall, which is in Demopolis, and Lyon Hall was built by her son-in-law, George Lyon. So we can conjecture, that she put this together as a wedding gift for her daughter and her son-in-law. They moved to their new home after it was completed in the 1840s. But this quilt was found wrapped in a Birmingham News dated Sunday, August the 15th, 1928. And it was a note that said the maker was Mrs. Glover and the year that she actually made it. So those are the windfalls that we came across. Not very seldom, but and it stresses the importance of, leaving documentation with your work. Session quilt is an interesting, about 1840s, you're able to purchase. They were buying these real interesting colors in the fabrics as well. This one was actually made in South Carolina and came to Alabama as well. Came to South Carolina. And what she did was, this was made by Mrs. Todd. She went and she sent a letter to all of her friends around, the South. And by doing that, she asked them to put together a star of their some of their dress fabrics, as you can see here. What they did then, a little bit of a right here. She then wrote the name of the state that they lived on. So she was able to put together this quilt of the multiple states that her friends lived in. And oddly enough, most of them were states that did secede from the Union. The wedding album quilt was made in Talladega, 1850. Some of you may have heard about it. It's the famous Mount Ida quilt that has had tons of research done on it. It was made by members of the Mallory and the Welch family in Mount Ida, the plantation up in Talladega County. It was made for a wedding in the 1850. And all the different members of the family, female members of the family, stitched an album block, and then they put them all together. It's very well documented as to who made it, and then what happened. Our friend Sarah Bliss Wright, who did lots of research on this, she's actually from the Mount Ida area. She did lots of research on this quilt, and then she went back to the descendants of all the original stitchers, and they reproduced this quilt. So there's the older 1850, and then there's the 21st century album quilt. And I believe these live at the Archives and History too, both of the quilts. This is a little detail with the signature on it. Another album quilt was his Freedom Quilt. It was done in Warrior, which is just above Jefferson County. 12 girls, young girls, got together and made this album quilt for Obadiah Perry Butler on the occasion of his 21st birthday. We know that about it, but we don't know exactly why. Was he extra special? We don't really quite know. We do know that Obadiah did go to, he did enlist in the Confederate Army, and he was in Company C, and he served under fighting Joe Wheeler. He did come home, and he lived the rest of his life in the Warrior Stand until 1899. This is a very popular 20th century, the grandmother's flower garden, but we saw it in the 19th century rarely. This is from Union Springs. But the interesting thing about this particular quilt is that it had all of this extra on it. It has brocade and fringe along the side as well. It's made in Union Springs in the third quarter of the 19th century, a little early from the crazy quilt era, but was such an interesting piece to find as well. We do have a essay about log cabin quilts, their origin and their importance, done by Flavin Glover of Auburn, Lee County, as a sidebar in the quilt book as well. Log cabins were very popular, but they were also very difficult to make. This particular quilt was made in Guntersville about 1863, and the wife of the soldier, she had made him a new uniform. When on his next trip home, she would have some new clothes for him to take back to the front. But he didn't quite make it back. He was killed by a sniper as he walked home from the Battle of Chattanooga. So in her grief, she created this log cabin quilt, as well as the black edges, which indicate her mourning. The non-patch illustrates the politicalness that some of these quilts show. This is probably either Winston or Coleman County, right at the beginning of the Civil War. It's an unknown maker, but the real interesting fabric that is in it, on the back and in the sashing, the Constitution must be preserved. This particular quilt lives in the collection, the permanent collection of the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art, and was made by probably Annie or Jamie Odom. You can't quite really tell the signature on this particular one, but definitely a political statement. The Florida Quilt Heritage Project, just like our project here in Alabama, was documenting Florida-made quilts back in the 1980s. This quilt, the Pinwheel, was made by Mary Ellen Miles out of Barber County. So it appears in the Florida. The family members bring it in and they're like, this is an Alabama quilt, who we can send it to. So the Florida Heritage Project contacted the Birmingham Museum back in the 1980s. And although it's not a museum quality quilt, it did come to live with us in the collection at Old Alabama Town because it is so heavily documented. It was made by Mary Ellen Miles in Barber County in 1864. And at that point, she was already 71 years old. It's all hand-dyed. You can tell by the migration on the, which is sort of how it leached out and how it has faded. And we also have a photograph of her house as well. This is where she actually lived all her life, sort of a small dog trot. In her later life, since she was a seamstress, she made mattresses for the needy in the county area. This is one of my favorites. This is the Carpenters Wheel, and it was made by Catherine Johnston Roberts and her daughter as well. We saw a lot of these mother and daughter, which shows how our quilting tradition here in Alabama is so rich, as it was passed down from generation to generation. About 1870, something like that, in Clay County. I believe this one is also in the collection of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. This is a really nice detail of the exquisite quilting on here, and an interesting iris she actually put, which obviously that must have been one of her favorite flowers. The Ohio rose came from the Montgomery area about 1880, and we start to see at this particular point this orange, this bright orange is known today to quilters as cheddar because it's the color of cheese, and it's one of the earliest chemical dyes that you were able to purchase. Its real name is antimony orange for the chemical that's used to create it. This is a little bit of a detail that tells us that Lydia Duncan made this in 1857. But that's about all we know off the top of our heads about this, except connected to it, some documentation from the Montgomery Advertiser, Alabama Journal in 1859. In 1959 is an article that talks about this lovely gift that was given to the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art. So that's how we know who made it, where she was from, and how it ended up in a museum collection. Another use of this beautiful cheddar here, which really, really sets off this four-pointed feathered star with an autograph cross, which is the cross that you see actually in the pattern, at 1886 in Fayette County. And it was made by Arminda Studdard, 1886. She made this when she was about 16 years old, and she saved her money to buy this antimony orange, but she used all the rest of it were actually scraps from the dresses that she made. This is Pickle Dish. This is another one of my favorites. I love this one. This is from Elmore County, eclectic, about the same time frame, late 19th century. It's made by Mrs. Marion Cotton, and she made this with her daughter also, Bobby. One of the things that we learned, which was very interesting as we were looking and analyzing all of these quilts, is that you would assume that the batting was cotton. But we saw, for the most part, wool batting, which was really kind of odd and threw us off. But when you think it through, cotton was a cash crop. So you wanted every piece of cotton that you could to go to market to create, an income for you. But the sheep, that was a renewable, sustainable resource. So we saw lots and lots of wool batting that was used in Alabama quilts. The crazy quilts are always popular, and we saw lots and lots of them, but they're so interesting because they tell so many stories. This particular one is just a sampler, all different types of design work. It was made by the members of the Gans family in Mobile, and there is a date on it of 1888. And in the very center, you have a central monogram, IMG. So we don't know if this was the sole owner, the coordinator, maybe it was a Christmas gift, a wedding gift. We don't know all of those things, although the quilt told us a lot about itself anyways. This is 1884, another crazy quilt here from Montgomery. It was made by Julia Harris, silks, velvets, all fought. Most people think that that was probably ties, men's ties. But this one also has, and we saw this in a lot of crazy quilts, a ribbon, which was a souvenir of the Montgomery Grays, who were actually a regiment here. The quilt is dated 1884, and there are some lots of different initials throughout it. Obviously, people who actually helped put the thing together. You also could buy pre-embroidered pieces that a lot of people who weren't quite as talented would buy and then insert them into their crazy quilt. This is a Star of Lemoine that we found down around the Dauphin area. Now, the Lemoine brothers were French and they moved to Canada and they explored what we now know today as Louisiana Purchase, but they're also credited with founding the cities of Mobile and maybe even New Orleans. The first quilts that use this Lemoine Star motif are found around the New Orleans area. And you see this in a lot of patchwork. So it's very unusual for it to crop up in a crazy quilt as well. The pine tree from DeKalb was made by Jenny Dobbs, all natural daws. And then we've got the bow tie here from Marshall in Blount County, made by Mrs. Dalton Nesmith, the very end of the 19th century. She's got the cheddar, the chemical dye, as well as some other dyes in there as well, but you can see the fading and the migration of all of the different colors. This is another one of the quilts that was not actually made in Alabama. It's a Red Cross quilt. It was made during World War I for the soldiers fighting in France by Mrs. Eugene Hurd and a lot of the different family members over in Elbert County, Georgia, right during the time frame there of the war. And lots of these quilts were made, and then they were sent to the Red Cross to be distributed to the soldiers on the front. The red crosses are appliqued on a white background. This is actually in the collection of a local person here in Montgomery. And the reason he got it because it was given to his father, who fought in Alabama's Rainbow Regiment during World War I. But his father was home. He received the quilt, was ready to head out back to France, and the war came to an end. So the quilt itself never saw, nor the father never saw any combat, but it was put together for a very good purpose to support the troops. This is another one of the political statements at the strip quilt in Hale County. This is the Ku Klux Klan quilt. Early 20th century, the actual emblems are from the early 20th century, and the emblems on the robes were found in an abandoned meeting place, a meeting hall in Greensboro in Hale County. The owners who purchased it around the 1940s, they didn't know what to do with it, and they actually took it to some local quilters who created this quilt in the 1940s and 50s. And in doing that, they also added the Army Air Force observer. These were the folks in World War II who were watching for the planes or the unidentified aircraft that were flying at night. So it's a really interesting and unusual piece that was put together. The pine burr from Watauga County, beginning of the 20th century. This maker's unknown, but it was actually given in payment to a Dr. Wilkinson in Prattville for payment for medical services in the 1930s. And so instead of money, this is what they had to barter with. So it actually came to a quilt share day in the collection of the doctor's family as well. This in 1997, it was the legislature made it the official state quilt pattern. Here's a detail of the pine burr. And they're very heavy and they were very, very hard to shoot. A quick chapter we did was anything goes because we found so many interesting and unusual types of quilts that were just different. This is the Snowball, a Roman coins pattern. that Miss Elizabeth Overton made with her daughters, the beauties in the back there. And we love the little dog too in the very front, about 1935. We don't know what the name of this design is, but Miss Martha Norman came up with this in 1935. Her husband worked in a tire shop, and the materials were off of the inside of the retreads. She just wasn't going to, she was going to recycle everything. This is another Roman coins, which is a vertical strip here from DeKalb County in the 30s as well. These are sock tops. On DeKalb, around the the Fort Payne area, there was a hosiery mill, and these were the tops of socks. Hijacks were what we call Coozies. This was made by Mrs. Land in DeKalb as well, from surplus pieces a little bit later, about 1950. And her husband worked at a mill in Fort Payne, where these little tiny jackets that slipped over a 6-ounce soda bottle were made. And these were apparently redecked. So he brought them home and she put them together in this lovely quilt around 1950. I just wanted to give you a sneak preview of what you would see in the Alabama Quilt Book. I want to again thanks to all our supporters that helped make it happen: the Alabama Department of Archives and History, the Bicentennial Alabama State Council on the Arts, and all the other supporters. For those of you who are really interested in decorative arts, we do have a presentation April 22nd on my Mount Ida quilt that Sarah Bliss Wright will be given, as well as on May 6th, a presentation about the gunboat quilts, which live in the Birmingham Museum of Art. They are quilts that were discovered during the Alabama Decorative Art Survey in the 1980s and were conserved and lived, and there's four existing in the state right now and have a really interesting story. I didn't touch on that now, but it is included in the book as well. So you're welcome to visit us and hear all about these by visiting the Landmarks Foundation website as well. But that gives you a little bit of tiny insight into what's happening in Alabama quilts. And like Scotty said, they were going to put the link up if you're interested in purchasing one at the Alabama Department of Archives and History's museum store as well. So thank you very much.
Carole, thanks so much. Really great presentation. Just so interesting to see all the colorful quilts. And for those of you who don't yet have your own copy of the Alabama Quilt Book, I can tell you that it is a fraction of the wonderful images that you can find in there. So thank you so much for sharing that presentation with us and a little bit about sunshine and the process of the quilt documentation days. Those are really important. And our viewers might be interested to know that the information from those documentation days are now available for research here at the Department of Archives and History as well. So we want to encourage our viewers to go ahead and post a few questions in the comments. I'll start us off with a few hear from some of the folks at the archives. Carole, we want you to tell us a little bit about the care and storage of our own Alabama quilts. What are some quick tips that you can give us for the way those should be properly stored so they can be enjoyed generations to come?
Well, Scotty, I think you guys are really on top of the situation. That was one of the things that we did. We helped, you were redoing your quilt storage. And since in the Decorative Art Survey, the archive quilts had not been documented, Sunshine and I came over, and as they were moving them, we rolled them out, photographed them, did our documentation, our 6-page documentation form, working with your curators, and then they rolled them onto the large acid-free tubes, and then layered them with acid-free paper, and then you guys were able to cover them with Mylar, which is great because then you can see. And then they're on these large quilt racks, which we have just finished reproducing your quilt racks down here. So we're working on our quilt project down here at Landmarks Foundation too. You know, most people aren't able to do that, but I think, like we were talking to other people, we tried to impart some educational conservation tips on, like, obviously we could say you had stored this, had sat on the end of a cedar chest in the sunlight, or you had it on a bed and the dog jumped on top of it. So we were able to really talk to people about how to conserve their family heirlooms as well, which I think was a really big plus on our quilt share days. I think that for those people in collections management or in other museums, that what the Archives and History has done in right now currently, their quilt collection is really probably the state of the art in conservation.
Right. Thanks for that. I want to talk to you a little more about some of the families that you have represented here in the quilt book. Are there any families who have more than one quilt? Are there families that contributed pieces to the book that span generations?
That's a good question. There are so many. There are, and that's what this quilt was meant to be. It was meant to be a survey, but it has documented so many of them in there. We have like I said, we have multi-generationals. We saw that, it was done, quilting was done in the house originally. There was more family oriented. And then, as Alabama becomes more popularized, the
Right.
you see the bees, or you see the church communities beginning it, and quilting becomes not just a family thing, but a community thing as well. We do talk a lot about it, which Sunshine was very interested in and had done a lot of research. Around World War I, we have the Cooperative Extension Service is created, where we're teaching women domestic arts. And that's when you really see a surge of things like canning and teaching people to new cooking techniques, but you also see it in textile and quilting as well. You see competition begins to pop up with state fairs and different types of county extension fairs that we cover in the book as well, which helped popularize. And so there were so many more quilts at that particular point in time. But before that, it had been a generational thing. I know with the Alabama Folklife Association, they have documented some what we call traditional quilters, which means it passes down from family to family to family to family, either through the family and the bloodline, or you also see it passed down traditionally the community, like you see in Wilcox County, the Freedom Quilting Bees, and currently the Gspin, where it's not necessarily within the family, but it's neighbor to neighbor in the community.
Right. Well, you mentioned Gspin there again. That's a question we have from an audience member, Tammy Clark. Ask, are there any Gspin quilters featured in the book?
The Gspin, the forerunner of the Gspin was it's the quilting bee. I can't remember. There was another quilting bee that was a generation before the actual the Freedom Quilters. It was the Freedom Quilters, the
Right.
40s and the 50s, right? And then it evolved into the Gspin. So we do cover some of that. It does, however, fall behind our 1950.
Right.
And that was part of why we had to kind of had to put a deadline, because we have so much to cover. And so that is really a whole field to be looked at as well. We did include a fair amount of African-American quilts in there. We had some great African-American quilts from Union Springs. And one of the things about the Alabama quilts not living here anymore, there are two very nicely documented Alabama collections, Susanna Hunt, and there's another family that was from Pike in Crenshaw County. The collections now live at the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. And they're sort of an example of that northern migration, where the families from the Black Belt, and in the 40s and 50s, they go to up north for job opportunities. And so the quilts actually end up in other institutions, but they're very well taken care of at Henry Ford. And we went actually went to Detroit and documented the Susanna's collection up there as well. So there's an awful lot of work to be done in that too.
Right, right. A second volume, perhaps, Carole.
Well, that was Sunshine's intent. That was she left us a very large file folder full of ideas.
Yeah, I want to ask you about quilt patterns. Are there certain patterns that you see that are popular in Alabama throughout the generations? Certain patterns or motifs that are more common than others here in Alabama?
Alabamians were extremely creative. They did not stick to, there were very common ones that we saw. There were very complicated ones that we saw. The pickle bat, the pickle dish. That's when, like I said, and the star patterns were very complicated. And we saw a lot of stars, whether it be a central medallion star or the stars in squares. We saw a lot of star quilts as well. And they were used for quilts, were obviously used for warmth, but these really fancy quilts that survived were commemorative quilts, wedding quilts, show quilts, and by the time the 20th century comes along, they're competitive quilts. In the 20th century, you also see the kit quilts, which became popular. We started seeing those in the 1930s and 40s. And although we documented them, Sunbonnet Sue's, the grandmother's flower garden, some of those, we did document the really, really nicely done ones. They were very lots and lots of those as well, because we were really, really quilting by the 1920s. It became such a hobby thing. We were very surprised to see as many crazy quilts as we saw.
Sure.
But the crazy quilt is a way to use your scraps, but it's also a very fancy way to use your scraps, and then to also demonstrate your other hand work abilities as well, with all the embroidery stitches and things that went into it too. So we saw an awful lot of crazy quilts as well.
Well, those are really fun and visually entertaining, and it's great in a book like yours that there are detail shots that you can really see the artisan, the level of the artisanship, and just the stitching is also really, really interesting. I want to ask you about, you mentioned the cheddar color and the process of getting there. Are there other dyeing processes that are used a lot in Alabama quilts, and are there any of those that hold up better over time? Or there some that fade more quickly? There's a science angle here to the process of dyeing this material that's interesting.
Very chemical, you're right. And this was something Gail Andrews at the Birmingham Museum. Gail had started out being the quilt queen, in other words. She was very, very interested, through the decorative arts survey in the 1980s, and her intent was a quilt book. And but as time went on, we were working with Gail, and she basically became the director of the Birmingham Museum. And she said, please take my files. And so she very graciously shared all of that with us. And that was one of her things, was exploring the different colors and how they were produced. A lot of that has to do with, of course, where you're living, the resources you have in the clay to make your dyes, and the other types of, a natural resource that you had to make your dyes, and then your mordant. That's the really important part. If you know what you're doing and you're dyeing, and you use the mordant, which makes your dyes hold or stick,
right,
then they would last a lot longer in the quilt. If you didn't quite know, then you were going to lose your color very quickly. So that helped date a lot, plus the acidity, and a lot of the those dyes were detrimental to the quilts themselves. They basically ate themselves up, and you would see lots of spots in that, which then gave us, we could see the insides of the quilts. But so the quilts themselves were able to tell the stories of their owners and where they were, and of their abilities too. But the chemical part of it is very interesting. By the 20th century, you can purchase commercial dyes.
right.
The orange is the first, and then we started to see, the early 20th century, we started to see that kind of, I call it schoolhouse green, but it's that kind of soft green that we saw a lot in the early 20th century.
Sure. Another specific care question we have, Carole, from Courtney Pinkard. We're going to put that up on the screen here. Courtney has an heirloom quilt that was made by her great-grandmother, stored in a closet for about 30 years, and it has a musty smell. She wants to know any advice for refreshing the old quilt.
Well, without being able to look at it, I'd be hard. That was one of the things that Sunshine would, always say when she did a presentation. One of the things in the conservation part of her, she would talk about a friend of hers that had washed a quilt, thrown it in the washing machine, and it had come out all wadded in holes, and she's like, "What do I do?" And Sunshine's response was, "You just need to kill yourself. There's just nothing you can do about it." It was always the showstopper. There's nothing you can do about that. Without looking at it, and your best thing, of course, is to a real conservator to look at it and to analyze it. But sometimes just putting it out in the fresh air and the sun helps an awful lot. Just for a couple hours. I mean, you don't want it to be, you don't want it exposed to grass, dirt, whatever. But sometimes it just needs some fresh air. If you have a large dryer, just maybe with a sheet with it to help buffer on the fluff, just to sort of get air circulating through it. But, a really good place for a quilt is actually on a bed if it's not exposed to light and if it's not exposed to people. The guest bedroom, we call that the guest bedroom syndrome, where it's open, it has no folds, and it has, it's allowed to breathe and keep fresh air in it.
All right. Well, that's a good tip. So, Carole, you've told us today about how really every quilt tells a story. And so to end today, I wonder if you would tell us the story behind the quilt that's just behind your shoulder there. It's a very nice piece. Tell us a little bit about there's probably a very specific reason you're showing us that piece. So tell us about it.
That's just one of my favorite. That actually is a Gspin quilt. And to me, it just talks about the simplicity of it. The Gspin has been an interesting phenomena, and it's a wonderful place to visit and to meet the ladies in context, to see where they live and to see them working together and to see what they produce. That is just a very simple square on square. And of course, right now they're producing for sales. People love it, and they appreciate it. So that just reminds me of the community that quilting actually emerges from, whether it was in 1682 or whether 1950 or even 2021. It's what community is behind the maker that produces this type of handiwork.
Terrific. Well, Carole King, thank you so much for sharing the story of the Alabama Quilt Book with us.
Thank you.
For giving us a moment to pause and remember fondly Sunshine Huff, and to just take a moment to think about this great work that you all have done. We're so pleased to have it in the universe now, and we encourage everyone to go to the Alabama website and purchase their own copy. So we'll conclude the program there for today, but we want to remind you about our Food for Thought presentation, which will be at noon on April the 15th. And a final note as well, as Carole said, the Alabama Quilt Book was published in cooperation with the University Press of Mississippi and with the support of the Friends of the Alabama Archives. It's just one example of the many efforts that the Friends organization does to promote and support both the mission of the Alabama Department of Archives and History and the broader work to preserve and protect and present Alabama history at large. And you can be a part of that by joining the Friends of the Alabama Archives. We'll put a link to that in the comments as well. So thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thank you.